The federal government tried to lock a man away for 15 years over a gun and a joint. When federal agents raided a home in 2022, expecting a major terrorist threat, they found nothing but a personal firearm and a regular cannabis habit. Instead of dropping the case, prosecutors weaponized a sweeping federal statute to demand a 15-year prison sentence, claiming marijuana use automatically makes you too dangerous to own a gun. But a unanimous 9-0 Supreme Court decision just shattered this decades-old federal playbook. This is the story of how a failed national security raid triggered a constitutional showdown that protects millions of Americans. To understand why this case matters, we must look beyond the immediate headlines of drug policy and examine the structural machinery of federal law enforcement. The United States Supreme Court recently handed down a unanimous 9-0 decision in the case of United States versus Hamani. While the public might frame this as a simple dispute over cannabis, the underlying legal reality is far more systemic. For decades, the federal government has operated under the assumption that it possesses the unilateral authority to disarm any citizen who uses an illicit substance, regardless of whether that individual has ever exhibited violent behavior. In this case, the government argued that because the defendant used marijuana a few times a week, he was automatically classified as a prohibited person under federal gun law. There was no allegation that he committed a violent crime, no claim that he was high while handling the firearm, and no evidence that he threatened anyone. The government's position was simple. Possessing a firearm in the home while being a cannabis user is a federal crime under Section 922, subsection G, paragraph 3 of Title 18 of the United States Code. By rejecting this, the Supreme Court ruled that the government's prosecution under this unlawful user provision is inconsistent with the Second Amendment. This decision exposes a decades-old mechanism of federal power that has stripped an entire class of citizens of their constitutional rights, without ever proving they are personally dangerous. By challenging this status-based disarmament, the ruling forces a fundamental reassessment of how the state balances public safety with individual liberties. It marks a major shift in constitutional jurisprudence, signaling that the federal government cannot simply label a large segment of the population as inherently dangerous to strip them of their rights. That practical detail is what keeps the section anchored to a clear, real-world point. To understand how this landmark case reached the highest court in the land, we must look at the actual events that triggered the arrest of Hamani. The story begins in 2022, when federal agents executed a search warrant on his family home. The justification for this high-stakes raid was not a routine drug investigation, it was based on active terrorism-related suspicions. Yet, when investigators combed through the residence, the grand national security narrative collapsed. They found no evidence of terrorist plots, no ties to extremist organizations, and no indications of violent conspiracies. Instead, federal agents uncovered two things: a firearm kept inside the home and evidence that Hamani used cannabis approximately every other day. Faced with a collapsed terrorism investigation, federal prosecutors pivoted to a highly punitive fallback mechanism. Rather than admitting the raid was a failure, they brought a single criminal charge of possessing a firearm while being an unlawful user of a controlled substance, seeking a prison sentence of up to 15 years. This pivot highlights a common tactic in federal prosecutions. When a high-profile investigation fails to yield the expected results, prosecutors search for any technical violation to justify the resources spent. In this case, they weaponized a broad federal statute that had rarely been challenged on constitutional grounds. By transforming a personal habit and a home defense weapon into a major federal felony, the government set the stage for a dramatic legal battle. Hamani was not a violent criminal, but his case became the perfect vehicle to challenge the federal government's overreach. The facts of the arrest demonstrate how easily federal power can be redirected against ordinary citizens when the original justification for an investigation falls apart. Analyzing these components reveals the underlying forces at play in this scenario. That practical detail is what keeps the section anchored to a clear, real-world point. The holding in United States versus Hamani represents a major victory for constitutional rights, with a real impact that extends far beyond a single defendant. The Supreme Court held that disarming an individual based solely on their status as an unlawful user of a controlled substance violates the Second Amendment. This ruling strikes at the heart of the federal government's ability to enforce blanket bans on firearm possession. The immediate impact is that millions of gun-owning cannabis users who reside in states where marijuana is legal are no longer automatic federal felons simply for exercising their constitutional rights. The court made it clear that the government cannot strip citizens of their Second Amendment rights without showing that they pose a specific, demonstrable danger to society. This decision effectively dismantles the government's ability to use status-based classifications to restrict constitutional liberties. For decades, federal prosecutors have used Section 922, subsection G, paragraph 3, as an easy tool to secure convictions, but that tool has now been severely weakened. The real-world impact will be felt in courts across the nation. as pending prosecutions under this statute are challenged and dismissed. Furthermore, this ruling sends a powerful message to federal law enforcement agencies that they must respect the constitutional boundaries established by the Supreme Court. By requiring an individualized assessment of dangerousness, the court has restored a critical layer of due process. This decision ensures that the Second Amendment is not treated as a second-class right, subject to the whims of federal prosecutors who wish to disarm citizens based on personal choices that do not harm others. This particular aspect is key to understanding the broader impact of the development. By breaking down these elements, we get a much clearer picture of the situation. Analyzing these components reveals the underlying forces at play in this scenario. That practical detail is what keeps the section anchored to a clear, real-world point. To defend this sweeping authority before the Supreme Court, the Department of Justice relied on a bizarre historical comparison: the habitual drunkard. The government's legal team argued that because alcohol and cannabis both cause intoxication, historical laws disarming chronic alcoholics should apply to modern cannabis users. They attempted to construct a historical lineage of disarmament to justify their current policy under the legal framework established in recent Second Amendment cases. But when Justice Neil Gorsuch examined the actual historical statutes, the government's analogy collapsed. The Supreme Court ruled that the comparison failed because historical laws targeting habitual drunkards did not apply to everyone who drank regularly. Instead, those historical laws only targeted individuals who were so severely impaired that they were legally incapacitated and required formal state intervention, such as the appointment of a guardian. The court noted that simply consuming alcohol, even regularly, did not result in the loss of one's constitutional right to self-defense. By trying to equate modern, responsible cannabis users with severely incapacitated individuals from the 19th century, the government stretched historical analogies past their breaking point. The court warned that granting the executive branch the power to designate entire groups as dangerous, based on such loose analogies, would quickly swallow the Second Amendment. This rejection of the drunkard analogy is a critical legal development, as it sets a high bar for the government when it attempts to justify modern gun control laws using historical precedents. It demonstrates that the court will not accept superficial comparisons that ignore the actual scope and intent of historical regulations. By breaking down these elements, we get a much clearer picture of the situation. Analyzing these components reveals the underlying forces at play in this scenario. That practical detail is what keeps the section anchored to a clear, real-world point. Examining these specifics helps clarify how the overall mechanism functions in practice. For millions of Americans who use cannabis and own firearms, this ruling changes the legal landscape in profound ways, but it also requires careful navigation. Previously, these individuals lived under the constant threat of federal prosecution, knowing that a single encounter with law enforcement could result in a 15-year prison sentence. Now, the fear of automatic prosecution for simple possession of a firearm in the home has been lifted. However, users must understand that this ruling does not create a completely unregulated environment. The federal government still classifies marijuana as a controlled substance, and the intersection of federal drug laws and gun ownership remains complex. What changes is that the mere status of being a cannabis user is no longer a sufficient basis for the government to disarm you. If you possess a firearm for self-defense within your home, you are protected by the Second Amendment, even if you consume cannabis in states that have legalized its use. This provides a significant measure of security for law-abiding citizens who have been caught in the conflict between state and federal laws. Yet, gun owners must remain cautious, as the ruling does not authorize carrying firearms while actively impaired, nor does it protect those involved in the distribution of cannabis. The legal system will take time to adapt to this new reality, and federal agencies may look for alternative ways to enforce restrictions. For now, the primary benefit is the elimination of the automatic felony designation for home possession, allowing citizens to protect their families without sacrificing their constitutional rights. That practical detail is what keeps the section anchored to a clear, real-world point. Examining these specifics helps clarify how the overall mechanism functions in practice. This particular aspect is key to understanding the broader impact of the development. By breaking down these elements, we get a much clearer picture of the situation. This rejection forces federal prosecutors to confront a hurdle they have spent decades avoiding: a genuine, individualized burden of proof. Before the ruling in United States v. Hamani, a federal prosecutor's job was remarkably simple. The government only had to establish two basic facts: the defendant possessed the gun, and they regularly used marijuana. Once those elements were proven, a conviction was virtually guaranteed. Now, that shortcut is gone. If police discover a firearm and cannabis in the same home, they can no longer simply write up a federal charge and call it a day. The prosecution must present concrete, specific evidence of active danger or immediate impairment. They must prove the individual was actively intoxicated at the exact moment they were handling the firearm. or that their state of impairment posed a demonstrable physical threat to the public. This shift from a status-based prosecution to a conduct-based prosecution fundamentally changes the dynamics of federal criminal cases. Prosecutors can no longer rely on generalizations about drug users to secure convictions. They must conduct detailed investigations, gather evidence of actual behavior, and meet a much higher standard of proof in court. This new burden will likely deter prosecutors from bringing charges in cases involving simple possession, as the resources required to prove active impairment or dangerousness are substantial. Consequently, this ruling protects citizens from arbitrary prosecution and ensures that the government must prove actual harm or threat before stripping a person of their liberty. By breaking down these elements, we get a much clearer picture of the situation. Analyzing these components reveals the underlying forces at play in this scenario. That practical detail is what keeps the section anchored to a clear, real-world point. Examining these specifics helps clarify how the overall mechanism functions in practice. This particular aspect is key to understanding the broader impact of the development. In the wake of this decision, defense attorneys across the country are filing motions to dismiss pending charges, but they must also contend with the strict limits of the ruling. The Supreme Court did not strike Section 922, subsection G, paragraph 3 from the Federal Criminal Code entirely. The statute remains active on the books. This means that under different circumstances, such as when an individual is actively committing a violent crime while under the influence, the statute might still be applied. Furthermore, the ruling does not force the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives to alter its retail regulations. When purchasing a firearm from a licensed dealer, buyers must still fill out Form 4473, where Question 20-1, paragraph F, explicitly asks if the buyer is an unlawful user of marijuana. Lying on this federal document remains a separate felony under Section 922, subsection A, paragraph 6, which carries a penalty of up to 15 years in prison. The Department of Justice is actively attempting to separate these paperwork violations from simple possession, arguing that while possessing a firearm in the home may be protected under the Hamani precedent, lying on a federal form to acquire that firearm is not. Additionally, the ruling does not protect individuals who are actively intoxicated while carrying a loaded firearm in public, nor does it shield those caught with large quantities of cannabis, where prosecutors can still argue a connection to violent drug trafficking. Defense motions must therefore be carefully tailored to the specific facts of each case, focusing on home possession and the lack of active impairment to succeed under the new precedent. Analyzing these components reveals the underlying forces at play in this scenario. That practical detail is what keeps the section anchored to a clear, real-world point. Examining these specifics helps clarify how the overall mechanism functions in practice. Beyond the immediate impact on gun rights, this ruling sends a broader signal regarding the future of federal drug legalization and policy. For years, the federal government has maintained a rigid stance on cannabis, classifying it as a Schedule I controlled substance with no accepted medical use. This classification has created a massive disconnect between federal law and the realities of state-level legalization. However, the Supreme Court's unanimous decision reflects a growing recognition that the federal government's traditional approach to cannabis is increasingly untenable. By refusing to allow the government to use cannabis consumption as a blanket justification for stripping citizens of their constitutional rights, the court has weakened one of the key pillars of federal prohibition. This decision comes at a time when the executive branch is undergoing a formal process to move cannabis from Schedule I to Schedule III under the Controlled Substances Act. While rescheduling is not complete legalization, it represents a significant shift in federal policy. The Hamani ruling adds momentum to this shift by demonstrating that the judiciary will no longer tolerate the inconsistent application of federal laws that penalize citizens for activities that are legal in their home states. As more states legalize cannabis, the pressure on Congress to reform federal drug laws will only increase. This ruling serves as a warning to lawmakers that if they do not update federal statutes to reflect modern realities, the courts will continue to dismantle them piece by piece. Examining these specifics helps clarify how the overall mechanism functions in practice. This particular aspect is key to understanding the broader impact of the development. By breaking down these elements, we get a much clearer picture of the situation. Analyzing these components reveals the underlying forces at play in this scenario. That practical detail is what keeps the section anchored to a clear, real-world point. Examining these specifics helps clarify how the overall mechanism functions in practice. The strength of this ruling is reinforced by the voting lineup itself, which represents a rare moment of consensus on a deeply polarized court. In an era of sharp ideological divisions, a unanimous 9-0 decision is a seismic event that carries immense legal weight. All 9 justices aligned to reject the federal government's overreach, combining distinct judicial philosophies to reach the same conclusion. Conservative justices like Neil Gorsuch focused on strict textualism and the lack of historical analogues, viewing the government's position as an unacceptable expansion of executive power. They argued that the Second Amendment must be protected from vague, status-based restrictions that lack historical precedent. Meanwhile, the liberal wing of the court, including Justices Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson, focused on the civil liberties and due process implications of stripping a citizen of a fundamental constitutional right based on a status-based classification. They highlighted the potential for discriminatory enforcement and the lack of protections for individuals who pose no actual threat to society. This rare alignment of originalists and civil libertarians created an impenetrable legal wall against the Department of Justice. The unanimity of the decision sends a clear message to lower courts and federal prosecutors that the government's position was legally indefensible. It ensures that the precedent set by this case is exceptionally strong and cannot be easily dismissed or narrowed by future courts. By coming together on this issue, the justices have established a robust framework for protecting constitutional rights against federal overreach. Examining these specifics helps clarify how the overall mechanism functions in practice. This particular aspect is key to understanding the broader impact of the development. By breaking down these elements, we get a much clearer picture of the situation. Analyzing these components reveals the underlying forces at play in this scenario. That practical detail is what keeps the section anchored to a clear, real-world point. This legal tension exposes a much larger systemic contradiction that Justice Clarence Thomas has highlighted for years regarding the Commerce Clause. The federal government has operated on two parallel conflicting tracks, looking the other way as 38 states legalized medical marijuana and 24 legalized recreational use, while maintaining that any participation in this state legal market makes a citizen an automatic federal felon if they own a firearm. This hypocrisy is further challenged by Thomas's long-standing arguments. Under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the United States Constitution, Congress has the power to regulate commerce among the several states. However, Thomas has argued that the simple cultivation and possession of marijuana for personal, local use within a single state does not constitute interstate commerce. If the activity does not cross state lines, the federal government's authority to regulate or prohibit it under the Commerce Clause is highly questionable. By applying this logic to the intersection of gun ownership and cannabis use, the foundation of federal prohibition begins to erode. If the federal government lacks the authority to regulate local cannabis possession, it cannot use that possession as a basis to disarm citizens under federal law. As the executive branch undergoes the process to reschedule cannabis, the government's justification for disarming users looks like a legal house of cards. Thomas's arguments provide a powerful constitutional roadmap for future challenges to federal drug and gun laws, suggesting that the era of unchecked federal authority over local activities may be coming to an end. That practical detail is what keeps the section anchored to a clear, real-world point. Examining these specifics helps clarify how the overall mechanism functions in practice. This particular aspect is key to understanding the broader impact of the development. By breaking down these elements, we get a much clearer picture of the situation. Analyzing these components reveals the underlying forces at play in this scenario. While the decision in United States v. Hamani is a landmark victory, it is equally important to understand what the ruling does not accomplish. First, it does not legalize marijuana at the federal level. Cannabis remains a controlled substance under federal law, and possession can still lead to non-firearm-related charges. Second, the ruling does not invalidate state-level gun restrictions. States are still free to enact their own laws regarding firearm possession and drug use, provided they comply with their own constitutional provisions. Third, the decision does not affect other categories of prohibited persons under federal law, such as convicted felons or individuals subject to domestic violence restraining orders. Those restrictions remain fully in effect and were not addressed by the court in this case. Additionally, the ruling does not protect individuals who are actively intoxicated while carrying a loaded firearm in public, nor does it shield those caught with large quantities of cannabis, where prosecutors can still argue a connection to violent drug trafficking. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives also continues to enforce its regulations regarding licensed gun dealers, meaning that the paperwork requirements for purchasing a firearm remain unchanged. Buyers must still answer questions about drug use honestly, and false statements can still result in prosecution. Therefore, while the ruling provides a critical shield for home possession, it does not grant blanket immunity to gun-owning cannabis users. Understanding these limitations is essential for anyone navigating the complex intersection of state cannabis laws and federal firearm regulations. Examining these specifics helps clarify how the overall mechanism functions in practice. This particular aspect is key to understanding the broader impact of the development. By breaking down these elements, we get a much clearer picture of the situation. Analyzing these components reveals the underlying forces at play in this scenario. That practical detail is what keeps the section anchored to a clear, real-world point. The unanimous ruling in United States v. Hamani marks a fundamental shift in how the federal government can restrict constitutional rights. By rejecting the lazy premise that cannabis use automatically equals dangerousness, the Supreme Court has forced a massive systemic change. The Department of Justice can no longer disarm citizens based on status alone. They must prove actual, individualized danger. While the legal battle over retail forms and federal regulations is far from over, the foundation of the federal gun ban has fractured. The question is no longer if the system will adapt, but how quickly it will be forced to yield.